Texas A&M took down Auburn for their first win over a number one team in program history. What does it mean for the Tigers down the stretch?
You are Locked On College Basketball, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
What's up, folks? Welcome into the Locked On College Basketball Podcast, a daily national college hoop show, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm your host, Andy Patton, for today's show, joined by Leif, Thulin, our host of the Locked On College Basketball Game Night shows every Saturday night, as well as our regular contributor here on Wednesday mornings. You are joining us at the place to get your college basketball content every single day. I want to thank all of you for making the show your first listen or your first watch of the day, and remind you that you can listen to the show ad-free on Amazon Music. Jam-packed show today. We're talking about the ranked games from yesterday, including Auburn getting knocked down by Texas A&M, ending their streak of being undefeated on the road in SEC games. We'll talk about that. Huge win for BYU in Ames against Iowa State in double overtime. That plus a lot of bubble results. Joe Lunardi's 12 of his 16 bubble teams were in action on Tuesday night. We'll talk about who were the winners, who were the losers, and then we'll close out the show previewing all of Wednesday's games, including a big one between Florida and Bama, a potential battle for the one of the number one seeds remaining. But Leif, let's start with this big-time game between Auburn and Texas A&M. And A&M led this game throughout. They never trailed against the number one team in the country, a team that had not lost a road game in conference play. Texas A&M never has beaten the number one team. And if there was a team this year, I feel like A&M, for those of you who are daily listeners, everyday listeners, shout out to you. I've been a little hesitant on Texas A&M, and I remain so. But I'm not surprised they did this. This is a team that the highs are literally they can beat anybody, and there's no debating that anymore. They beat the best team in the country on Tuesday night. They also are susceptible to taking some pretty ugly losses. They're a team that no matter where they get seated in the Big Dance, I'm going to have a really hard time figuring out what I want to do with this club. They miss so many shots, but they're tenacious on the boards. When Zhuric Phelps is playing well, like he did in this game, he had 19 off the bench. This team is really, really, really unstoppable. Certainly Wade Taylor IV, a huge role as well. But when you go out rebound anybody, especially the number one team in the country by 16, you're going to find yourself getting a lot of W's. Leif, what did you think about this game?
Yeah, I think it's important to note the psyche of both teams coming into this game. Texas A&M had lost 4 in a row and were returning to their home court, and it was a must-win basketball game because when the first bracket was revealed, like the mock bracket, they were a 2 seed. And since then, they've lost 4 straight games. They lost to Tennessee in a close one at Texas A&M. They lost to a couple where you thought, man, maybe they can win, but they weren't necessarily gimmies. But you just expected them to win 1, maybe 2 of those 4. Instead, they're 0-4. They needed this in the worst way. And then you flip the switch. It's Auburn. Auburn just clinched the SEC outright. So just the lack of motivation, even if it's not said, like, of course you want to win the game. I think there's just a little bit of complacency that comes with clinching early. And Denver Jones goes down. And then you look at the matchup. Anderson Garcia is like the perfect guy to guard Janai Broome. And so it's the same formula that Malik Brown used when he guarded Janai Broome. You have a quicker guy who can make it hard to get those catches on the flex screen offense that Auburn likes to run. And then you have to isolate, and Broome thinks, oh, I'm bigger, stronger than this guy. But they're good enough athletes, active enough. It makes it hard for Janai Broome. And then you didn't have Denver Jones, who's the point guard. And I've actually been critical of Denver Jones. I think he's a very good defender. I don't think offensively does that much. But maybe his value is more than I knew. And he's an orchestrator. He conducts the ship. Tahad Pettiford started. He's the more dynamic offensive player. But they looked a little disjointed. And I think a lot of credit should go to Texas A&M's defense and rebounding. But I think the complacency factored in as well. And you just knew Texas A&M had to gear up for this one and find themselves trying to trend forward towards the SEC tournament as opposed to the spiral that they were on.
Yeah. A&M closes with LSU on Saturday, a road game for them, a game they should win in that one. And then Auburn, of course, closes with Bama at home. A little bit more pressure on that Bama game now. I think certainly Bama's going to feel a lot more of that pressure. We'll see as we get to that preview of that Florida game tonight, what kind of position Bama finds themselves in when they come into that game against Auburn. But for Auburn, I think the main question is, are they still the number one overall seed? And Duke jumped them in the net rankings as they refreshed on Wednesday morning. Duke's now number one. Auburn's now number two. Neither of these teams have a loss outside of quad one. Both have 3 quad one losses. Duke has 6 quad one wins. Auburn has 15. That is just such a huge difference. Obviously, we know why. We know the difference between the SEC and the ACC just in terms of overall talent and depth of those 2 leagues. But to me, Auburn still has the best resume in college basketball. They still are, in my mind, the best team and the team that should be the number 1 overall seed. But there is clearly an argument for Duke at this point. Obviously, the determining the answer to this question will be based on how they do in their last games, how Duke does against North Carolina, how Auburn does against Bama, and then, of course, getting into those conference tournaments. But for me right now, this hasn't changed where Auburn is. They're still the number 1 team in the country. For me, they're still the number 1 overall seed. Is that where you're at with them, or you think Duke's kind of making some headway there?
I don't think it's crazy to say Duke could be the better team. Like I don't think that's crazy.
No.
But in terms of the number 1 overall seed, it has to be Auburn.
Yeah.
I think there's not a way in which they could lose against Alabama and then lose first weekend of the SEC or first game that they play after the buys of the SEC and still be a 1 seed. They may not be number 1 overall, but that's how well entrenched they are in terms of their resume. 15 quad 1 wins is ridiculous.
Yeah.
And then Duke, I think you can make an argument they're playing better basketball right now. Auburn obviously had a nice stretch. They beat Alabama at Alabama. They've won a couple other games, and some more convincingly than others. Like they destroyed Kentucky at Kentucky on Saturday. So, yeah, we're flipping our tune just because they lost 1 game. But it's not really that for me. It's more that Duke is dominating so much. So it's the Gonzaga effect. Like for years and years, Gonzaga win a couple games by 20 or 30. And everyone says, oh, it's the lack of competition. How good are they? Well, many of those years, Gonzaga made the Elite 8, Final 4.
Right.
And so I think Duke's in that similar trajectory. So if you Duke's better for their like not resume related things, just their basketball, that's fine. But resume wise, it has to be Auburn. And I think Duke is peaking. Like their defense is really good, and their A game when they get going, they run you out of the gym. And that's what keeps happening. Cooper Flagg just played a masterclass. I think one thing to note, I think Janai Broom struggling in that game, Cooper Flagg having 28, 8, and 7 is more important than people realize, even though it's just, hey, it's like Cooper Flagg beat a terrible team. But I think that may have swung some National Player of the Year implications.
Speaking of teams that are peaking at the right time, we got to talk about this BYU team. 23rd ranked Cougars take down number 10 Iowa State in Ames, double overtime, 88-85. And look, BYU had this thing well in hand. They were up like almost 20, or maybe I think they even had a 20-point lead at one point. With 6 minutes to go, they were still up by double figures, up 11. And then Iowa State stormed all the way back, tied this thing up with 44 seconds to go. Thing goes all the way into overtime, and BYU still finds a way to win. And I'm more impressed. Like, obviously, if they just maintained a 20-point win and thrashed Iowa State, that would be an incredible win for BYU. But the conversation would be about Iowa State. Right now, Iowa State climbed back at home, tied this thing, sent it into overtime, and BYU still found a way to win. That is really, really hard to do. That talks about the moxie of this team, the talent of this team, the coaching of Kevin Young in his first year as a head coach at the collegiate level. Just some really impressive stuff. Richie Saunders, 23 points, 13 of them coming at the free throw line. Dallin Hall had 22 off the bench. BYU turned the basketball over 29 times, Leif, 29 times, and they still won this basketball game. Just insane stuff going on in Ames. That's 7 wins in a row for BYU. They're 22-8. They're 13-6 in the Big 12. They've been kind of floating in that 8-9 seed range for a while. To me, this is a win that definitively pushes them out of that conversation, barring a collapse in their loss to Utah and then a struggle in the Big 12 tournament. I think this team's going to be in that 7, maybe 6 seed conversation like they were last year. This was a really big one for the Cougars.
I wouldn't even be surprised if they're a 5 seed.
Yeah.
Like their resume in terms of their wins recently has been fantastic.
Yeah.
I know I was at the Kansas game. It was horrible. Kansas played terribly, but that's still Kansas. That's the team that beat Duke. They beat Arizona at Arizona, Iowa State at Iowa State. But this game might have been my favorite game of college basketball all year.
Yeah.
Because it was just the chaos but shot making for a while, and then the fatigue set in. So I think what the difference was once you got to the overtimes was BYU got more repeatably makeable shots. And Iowa State had to struggle so hard. They had to execute. Jefferson was really good. I feel badly for Jefferson, who had a really tough moment to end the first overtime, was trying to get the ball in the mid-post, took his eye off the ball, and then at the start of the second overtime had a turnover. Iowa State had back-to-back turnovers to start overtime and then a bad possession or two to finish. They shot kind of forced threes. And then, of course, that last possession where Momcilovic got a grenade and just had to hoist it. But BYU looked to me to have the better mix of athleticism with Keba Keita in the front court. And they would space it out and get a good shot every time because they have multiple ball handlers. And Iowa State's a team that I think, when fully right, is one of the best 7 teams in the nation. And I don't think that they have the mix yet. Like Keshawn Gilbert and Curtis Jones look kind of tentative out there. But when they're fully healthy, they're now 19-2. And even this, I might put an asterisk next to like fully healthy, because Keshawn Gilbert and Curtis Jones were considered All-Americans until they both got hurt. Right. And so I think this is a team that needs more legs, but it means all the more to BYU being able to recover mentally from giving up that lead. And I was impressed with Iowa State finding a way to come back to that game steadily and hit threes with Momcilovic, attack the rim. This is a team that I really like, and so it means all the more to BYU. BYU is a really tough team to beat because they score a ton. And athletically, when they lock in like they have recently, I know it's a high-scoring game, but it was double overtime. And then it was a high-scoring game against Arizona, but at the end of the game, they got better shots. So I am starting to believe in BYU's trajectory.
Couple other ranked games that happened on Tuesday, not as significant in terms of seeding or as significant in terms of the results, but I'm just going to rattle them off here, Leif, and if there's anything in particular you want to discuss on these contests. Purdue, 18th ranked Boilers, just thrashed Rutgers. I mean, just crushed them. 100-71 was the final score there. Purdue shot 69% in the first half, finished the game 18 of 36 from 3. Just incredible stuff. Leif, you have said this before, and it was very, very true on Tuesday night. Purdue is very dangerous when Fletcher Loyer is great. He had 23 in this one. He was 7 of 12 from 3, 3 assists, no turnovers, 23 minutes, and he had 23 points. When Fletcher Loyer is playing like that, this Purdue team, very, very scary. Number 19, Kentucky smacked LSU 95-64. Huge win for Kentucky, especially without coming off of that news that Jackson Robinson's going to miss the rest of the year. Otega Oweh, 24 points for him, 9 of 11 shooting. Memphis won at UTSA 75-70. Kind of an ugly game for Memphis, but they got the W. They're now 15-2 in the conference, 25-5 overall. Shout out Dane Danger, 19-8 for him. And then Arizona gets the season sweep against their rival Arizona State in a game that did not go into overtime, despite the score being 113-100. 213 points scored between these two teams. Trio of Wildcats were in 20-point territory. Visir had 22, Caleb Love had 21, KJ Lewis had 21. Just huge high-scoring game. Not a surprising result, of course, as Arizona State is now 4-15 in the Big 12, but always nice to get a win over a rival. Leif, any of those games or results or performances stand out to you at all, kind of as we're getting towards the end of the season here?
Well, the Arizona State game is weird because I still think of Arizona as a better defensive team than offensive. And I know they play quickly, so I understand the tempo thing, but giving up that many points is one thing. But the thing that may not be well known is Arizona State doesn't have that many scholarship players available. Yeah. So they came in with 7. Someone got kicked out early. Then they fouled out, and then they fouled out again. So that left 4 scholarship players for the last 6 minutes of the game. Yeah. So the fact that this was close is a little bit of a blemish to me on Arizona's performance. Good for them for winning, and that's all it's going to show on the record book. But I was kind of disappointed in watching that game. It was a track meet. There was some shot making, but everything Arizona wanted they could get because Arizona State looked fatigued. But on the other end, you'd expect Arizona's defensive. They're big to be able to get some stops, and they did not do that at all.
Yeah, Alston Mason had 33 for the Sun Devils. Jocelyn Sonan, a star freshman for them, had 19. Great offensive performance from the Sun Devils, especially considering their limitations and a bit of a concern for Arizona. If they defend that poorly against tournament caliber teams, that could be an issue for Tommy Lloyd's club, which we've seen the last couple of years when they get into the big dance. But Leif, want to move away from talking about the ranked teams, talk about the teams that we know are safely in the field of 68 to instead talking about the bubble teams. Because Joe Lunardi's recent update, he updates it on Tuesdays for his bracketology. 12 of those 16 teams that are on the bubble, they were all in action on Tuesday night. Some of them won, really helped solidify their spot in the big dance. Some of them lost. And one of them in particular probably just ended their opportunity of making the NCAA tournament, barring a big run in the Big East tournament. We're going to talk about that coming up in just a second. But first, folks, get the supplies that you need from the site made for the skilled trades, Supply House. Whether you're in plumbing, HVAC, or electrical work, Supply House is the reliable way to order products online. Their easy-to-use website is packed with helpful resources and the latest product information to help you get the job done right. Plus, with a complete inventory of over 200,000 parts from over 400 plus top brands, you'll find exactly what you need, delivered fast from coast to coast. Need help with your order? Supply House offers expert support and industry-leading service, so you'll always talk to a real person. And for trade pros looking for an extra edge, their free Trade Master program offers exclusive perks like a dedicated phone line, free shipping, and discounts on every order. Thousands of skilled professionals are already taking advantage. Now it's your turn. Join the Trade Master program today at supplyhouse.com/TM and start ordering plumbing, HVAC, and electrical supplies with just a few clicks. Plus, use promo code SH5 for 5% off your first order. That's supplyhouse.com. All right, folks, segment 2, still Andy Patton, still joined by Leif Thulin here on the Locked On College Basketball Podcast, and we're still going through the Tuesday game results. 12 of the 16 bubble teams, according to Joe Lunardi of ESPN, were in action on Tuesday night. All 4 of the teams that Lunardi listed among the last 4 byes had games on Tuesday. 2 of them won, 2 of them lost. We're going to go through them here. Baylor, the first team on the last 4 byes, they had just kind of fallen onto the bubble after being more securely in the field of 68. They go get a W at TCU, 61-58. Really needed this one. It was a close game, but hey, a W is a W. A loss here would have been very problematic for Scott Drew and the Bears. Norchad Omier, 19-12 for him. Baylor to close out the regular season against Houston. Would be really nice to get that one, but even a close game there probably keeps Baylor on the right side of the bubble. San Diego State, however, they lose at UNLV 74-67. And San Diego State's probably still in a safe spot, but they had an opportunity with winning this game and closing out the regular season against Nevada to go into the Mountain West Conference tournament in a more secure place. Now it feels like they got to do some damage. They got to win some games. They can't bow out early in the Mountain West tournament or else they might be in real trouble, find themselves being extra sweaty on Selection Sunday. Shout out Jordan Rishwain, who had 26 for UNLV in their upset win over the Aztecs. Georgia goes and wins at South Carolina, needed this one, 9-point win for the Bulldogs, who are also in that last 4 bye. Like we said, they just kind of needed not to lose. Can't do what Arkansas did, although we'll talk about Arkansas later. They got some redemption. But you can't go lose to South Carolina at this point. And Georgia gets the W here. They got Vanderbilt to close out the regular season. And then Indiana, our other loser among the last 4 byes, they went out to Oregon and lost at Oregon, 73-64. Not a terrible loss in a vacuum, a 9-point loss on the road.
A shot by Shellstad. Whew.
Yeah, exactly.
They easily could have won this basketball game for those of you listening. They were up 64-63.
Yep.
Jackson Shellstad hit a shot from about 37 feet on the left wing, catch and shoot, late clock. And then from then, you weren't going to win that game once that went.
He just sapped the momentum clean away from that Indiana team. That was a tough one. And now Indiana, they go to Ohio State, or they're host to Ohio State in their final regular season game. We'll talk about Ohio State in a second, but this now becomes a much more important game for Indiana. If they've been able to pull off this win at Oregon, that would more safely secure themselves in the field, but now they got a little bit more pressure on them. Out of these 4 teams, we talked Baylor win, Georgia win, Indiana loss, San Diego State loss. What do you think was the most important result in terms of the determining the field of 68 for the NCAA tournament?
Well, I think Baylor is going to make it, which is a shame because they are playing terribly. Like they're playing terrible basketball. But really I think they're going to make it. So if we're talking about like the decisiveness of, if they get a win, they're in. I think Baylor has enough wins that you say, well, that holds water. Yeah. San Diego State, I kind of disagree. I agree it gets a little sweaty, but I kind of disagree about them being on the bubble. Like they've beaten Houston and they've beaten Creighton. Not many teams that are from mid-majors can say they have wins like that, especially against Houston, who's a number 1 not overall, but number 1 seed, pretty much well entrenched in that spot. So I think they'll make it. I think the Mountain West gets 4, but yeah, obviously you'd ideally have liked to win that game. I obviously agree there. And then you look at a team like Georgia. I think their week, they probably had the best week of anyone the past 8-9 days of anyone in the country. They beat Florida. They took care of business and beat I forget who they beat on Saturday, and then they just won this game where they're supposed to. They take care of business and they win 3 games as well as beat a team that could have been a number 1 seed. I think they're well entrenched. So I think they and they beat Texas. Texas is the other one. So Texas gets a win, and that saves them. But Georgia just beat a team that may make the tournament in the process, as well as beating a number one or number two seed, and then takes care of business again. So I think Georgia has the best week of anyone.
Yeah, I would agree. Georgia did a lot of good work this week. I mean, the Texas win, it was a comfortable win. It was a road win. And now Texas picking up their win against Mississippi State helps Georgia's resume a little bit more. The Florida win, obviously, being the most notable. But you didn't take a stumble at South Carolina, and that it seems like, of course they shouldn't have. But that's not always easy to avoid. And shout out to them for not having a little dip after winning a couple of big games. Looking at the last four in teams that Lunardi had, two of them played each other. That was Ohio State and Nebraska. And this was another double overtime game. We got that great double overtime game between Iowa State and BYU. This one, 2 overtime game, and also a similar score to the Arizona State game, which I guess says a little bit about those two teams. 116 to 114, the final score here. Ohio State is the team that gets the win here. A much needed win again. Two teams very firmly on the bubble. Ohio State got it done. Bruce Thornton, 29 points and 9 assists. A Herculean effort from Bryce Williams of Nebraska, though, 43 points for him, 6 rebounds, but there was just not enough help from the rest of this Nebraska team, particularly on the defensive end of the floor. Ohio State's got a little momentum going into that road game in Bloomington against Indiana, another matchup between two bubble teams, whereas Nebraska will be hosting Iowa. Iowa, not a bubble team, but certainly a team capable of beating Nebraska. And if that happens, I think it's going to be very problematic for the Cornhuskers, who are still in this bubble conversation, but I think now they're 7-12 in the Big Ten. And I'm having a hard time seeing it for Nebraska at this point. This would have been a really nice win for them, and they weren't able to get it done. And now it feels like they're in a bit more of a precarious spot on the bubble at this point.
I'm right there with you. Like, I don't think either of those teams should make the tournament, Nebraska or Ohio State, because Nebraska's 7-12 in the Big Ten, and they're 17-13 overall. Yeah. And I don't think they've beaten anyone.
Yeah, they don't have very many good wins.
I mean, if you look at, they beat Creighton, and that was Creighton, and I believe that's when they were really struggling. Like, Creighton was sprawling a little bit. So they beat Indiana. Indiana's helped themselves, but that Indiana team was not very good if you look at the context. And they beat UCLA. Yeah. Then they lost 7 games in a row. No team that makes the tournament should, as a team like this. I'm not talking about a team that just gets injured and figures it out, but a team that's making it as a 10 or 11 should have 7 losses in a row. At that point, you should take a team that's rewarded for winning, even if they're from a smaller conference. So they've beaten Illinois, they've beaten Oregon. But again, those are teams that struggled for stretches. And I understand, like, wins are wins, but 17-13 with 7-12 is not very good. And frankly, Ohio State's 17-13 too. I don't think that's very good. They're 9-10. So obviously they helped themselves by winning. They could do a lot by beating Indiana and making it very interesting if they were to go into Indiana in their final game and win it. But I think the Big Ten is strength in numbers, but the top, Michigan State's been good. Michigan's been good. Maryland, those teams. But I think once you get to the 7 through 10 in the Big Ten, it starts to get ugly. And I think they're going to get in, but I don't necessarily agree with it.
Yeah, I'm kind of with you. I like, it's not horrible if either of these teams are like 11 play-in game type, in that situation, but we'll see how the Big Ten tournament goes. But I'm not incredibly impressed with either of these teams in that conversation at this point. It's just, again, it's the kind of tried and true conversation everybody's having at this time of the year. The bubble's just kind of weak this year, and there's just a lot of teams that are.
So why are we expanding? Well,
exactly.
Why expand when there's teams that are in, according to Lunardi, that aren't very good? Yeah,
exactly. Arkansas, next team here, last 4 in. I kind of thought that they might be dead in the water after that loss to South Carolina, but if there's any way to get yourself back in the conversation in a positive way, go win on the road against a team that's safely in the field. That's what Arkansas did. Go take down a Vanderbilt team that has put themselves in a really nice position with a really strong finish to the SEC season. But Arkansas goes out, gets a W there, 90-77 for them. Trevin Brazil, 16 points, 14 boards for him. Nice bounce back for this team after that loss to South Carolina. They got Mississippi State at home after that. And then Boise State, also in the last 4 in conversation. They just needed to go crush Air Force, and they did. 80-57, nice win for the metrics. It helps out to blow out a team like that. This would have been a catastrophic loss for Boise State, probably kicks them all the way off the bubble. But they got it done. So huge shout out to Boise State for winning that one. Huge shout out to Arkansas. Obviously, the Arkansas win being the more notable one, probably out of all of these games in terms of last four in. Is that kind of your same thought there?
Yeah, I was surprised they were on the right side of the bubble after the loss to South Carolina, but I certainly think this was a good win. I think this is a game where talent shined through. They're the more talented team than Vanderbilt, and they showed it. Even though Vandy's been a little more cohesive, but talent showed through in this game, and I think you gotta probably believe they're going to make it because they've strung together a lot of quality wins. Some of them on the road too against SEC competition of late. But they certainly aren't making it easy for themselves.
4 more games to talk about here on the bubble. 2 of them were among first 4 out for Lunardi. 2 of them were next 4 out. 3-1 combined for these teams. The loss was Villanova losing at Georgetown. They were the last team in the next 4 out, literally the last team on the bubble, according to Joe Lunardi. They lose to Georgetown. This is not Patrick Ewing era Georgetown. This is not first-year Ed Cooley Georgetown. This is a decent Georgetown team, but it was also a team that did not have their star freshman, Thomas Sorber, did not play in this game. And it's still a bad loss for Villanova. I mean, there's just no other possible way to look at it. To me, this is a killer. Villanova doesn't have any more games left until the Big East tournament. At this point, maybe if you make it to the Big East championship and lose, you still get in. But I think they're toast. I think this is it for Kyle Neptune's team. Your 3 teams that got W's, I'll just rattle them off quick. North Carolina wins at Virginia Tech. Needed it. North Carolina needed to win all 6 games leading up to that Duke game. They did it. They won 6 in a row going into the Duke game. Think they would really help themselves if they're able to beat Duke, but they at least put themselves in a position where even losing to Duke, they might still be able to make some noise if they do well in the ACC tournament. Texas won at Mississippi State. Huge win for Texas. Road win, overtime win. This was a really close game. Mississippi State tied it up by getting 5 points in like a very short period of time and then goes into overtime, but Texas still finds a way to get the W. Really needed it there. They're at home versus Oklahoma in their last game. Nice win for Texas. SMU holds off Syracuse. 2-point win for SMU. Kind of ugly. Very ugly, frankly, if we're talking about Syracuse. But hey, it's a win. Win is a win. They were down 8 at half, outscored Syracuse by 10 in the second half to get the W. I think North Carolina did what they needed to do. Texas clearly got the best win of the group. SMU didn't hurt themselves too badly. Villanova, though, that's a killer for them. Anything else on any of those games, Leif?
I think you nailed it. I mean, the Georgetown thing threw me for a loop because I thought you were talking prime Patrick Ewing, not the coach.
It's definitely not that either.
Took me a second to realize, and I was like, yeah, it's certainly not that.
Yeah, they haven't been that in a very, very long time. Well, Leif, we're going to move on. We're going to talk about Wednesday's games. We got Florida at Alabama. That's obviously the big game. That's the game everybody needs to be tuned into. It's determining or having a huge impact in determining a number 1 seed. Tennessee also in action at Ole Miss. We're going to talk about that. We're also going to talk about some bubble games going on tonight as well. All that coming up in just a second. All right, folks, segment 3, still Andy Patton, still joined by Leif Thulin. Moving on to talk about Wednesday's games here. We got 11 ranked teams in action. We got 3 bubble games all taking place on Wednesday, and they're jam-packed day of college basketball. Leif, I'm going to rattle off all of the ranked games with the exception of Missouri at Oklahoma, which is both a ranked game and a bubble game. So we'll talk about that in the bubble games. Just going to rattle off these games here, and we'll start here, obviously, the conversation with the big one between Florida and Bama. But the first game of the day among ranked teams, 13th ranked Maryland on the road at 17 ranked Michigan, the other ranked on ranked game. That game at 6:30 Eastern time on the Big Ten Network, FanDuel favoring the Wolverines by 1.5. Then, of course, you got number 5 Florida at number 7 Bama, 7 Eastern time on ESPN2. FanDuel favoring the home team Bama by 3.5. Number 11 Clemson going on the road at Boston College on 7 Eastern time on ESPNU. FanDuel favoring Clemson, understandably, by 13.5. Not our biggest margin, though, as we get to Colorado going on the road at number 9 Texas Tech, 8 Eastern time on ESPN Plus. FanDuel favoring the Red Raiders by 17.5. against a struggling Colorado team. Wisconsin, number 12 at Minnesota, not Marquette. That's a non-conference game. 8:30 Eastern time on the Big Ten Network. Badgers favored as the road team by 7.5. Now we get Marquette, number 20, going on the road at UConn. The most interesting of the non-ranked on ranked games here for sure. 8:30 Eastern time on FS1, FanDuel favoring UConn by 2.5. Tennessee at Ole Miss, number 4 Vols, Ole Miss unranked at this point. 9 Eastern time on ESPN2, BYU, FanDuel favoring Tennessee by 3.5. And then Cal at Louisville, 9 Eastern time, ACC Network, FanDuel favoring the Cards by 14.5. So a handful of not particularly interesting games in here, but some really fun ones as well. Leif, obviously the big storyline here. We know Auburn and Duke are still fairly well entrenched in number 1 seeds. We feel pretty confident, at least I do, and it sounds like you do as well, with Houston potentially having one of those 1 seeds as well. So that last spot's going to come down to Tennessee, who's going on the road at Ole Miss, and then Florida and Bama, who are taking each other on in Tuscaloosa. That is a huge game. What are you looking forward to in that one?
All of it. I can't wait. This is
Every part
a great
of it.
game. But the funny thing is, I think that Florida is the better basketball team than Alabama.
Mm-hmm.
And it's weird to say because Alabama, if you were to go 1 through 15, or whatever the scholarship account is,
Yeah.
you'd kind of lean towards Bama. But I think Florida fits together better.
Yeah.
And it's not like they're under talented. They have a first-team All-American, Walter Clayton.
Mm-hmm.
And it almost feels like Florida has been limping a little bit recently. They lost the game to Georgia, in which they weren't very good.
Yeah.
They beat the brakes off of Texas A&M, but it didn't feel like everyone played well. Like Walter Clayton shot poorly. Will Richard's been good in stretches. Elijah Martin's been inconsistent since coming back from injury. Thomas Houck and Condon are 2 of my favorite players in all of college basketball, but Condon's coming back from injury. So when this team's right, I think they're better than Alabama, and I think they're better than Tennessee. But the other 2 teams, I think, have been more consistent with the level. Alabama's favored, and probably deservingly so, because they're at home. But if you were to ask me which team I think has the best chance to go far in a tournament, I'd take Florida. Tennessee's the one that's actually helping themselves right now, but they're the team I have the least faith in. It's a weird little predicament.
Yeah, Bama in the midst of a ridiculous stretch where they just played Tennessee. Now they're playing Florida. Then they're going to play Auburn. They're literally playing all 1 and 2 seed caliber
and Bama
teams.
should have won that game. Like that's the thing is the story was, okay, Tennessee helped themselves and Jemai Mashack was fantastic, but Alabama should have won that game in all accounts. Like everything that happened took the very low percentage chance of happened.
Yeah.
They foul on it and one, and it's like bad play down the stretch, and it's reprehensible, but it's still unlikely.
Yeah.
And then it's an offensive rebound. Then both free throws go in. Then they have a turnover. They keep the ball out of bounds, and then they turn it over with a 5-second without taking a timeout. And then a 40-foot shot goes in. Alabama should have won that game, and I still didn't think they were all that cohesive. Like that's how talented this team is. And after that type of heartbreaker, typically teams rebound well and beat and win. Like that's what happens. But I would lean towards Alabama for that reason. But like I said, I think Florida's the better team.
Yeah, and that's a great point. And I think that's what I'm so intrigued about is like, can Bama rally the troops? Can Nate Oates get everybody together and line everybody up and say, hey, we need this one? Like we blew it in that Tennessee game. We should have won. We didn't get it done at the end. How can we kind of fix those things and take on a Florida team that, Martin's coming back from injury. Condon's kind of hasn't been the same since the injury. Like this is a phenomenal matchup between elite guards and Sears and Clayton, and then obviously Richard and Phelps and everybody else. Like it's going to be just an incredible matchup. But what I'm so intrigued by is, can Bama kind of like rally the troops and get themselves a win here, because they can't look ahead to Auburn. They got to take care of this one. They can't end this regular season on a 3-game losing streak. Certainly kicks you far out of the conversation for that 1 seed and puts you in a dangerous territory of needing to win some SEC games in the tournament to be a 2 seed. So this is Bama's in a tough spot right here in this final regular season games here. And I think they need to prove that they can win a tough game against a really good team. Whereas Florida, it's not that they have nothing to lose here, but like unless they get blown out, Florida's in an okay spot. It's a tough road game against a good team. So I'm very interested to see how Bama responds in particular. And I'm also intrigued by this Tennessee at Ole Miss game. Like it looks on paper like a top 5 team going to play an unranked team, but Ole Miss is very good. Chris Beard is a very good coach. This is not a foregone conclusion by any stretch. And I think if you're Florida and Bama, like you expect that, hey, there's a chance Tennessee doesn't win that basketball game. And whoever wins this game between those 2 teams has a really good chance of kind of sneaking back into that 1 seed conversation, because I don't think it would be very silly to assume Tennessee wins this game on the road against a team that's been in the top 25 for large chunks of the season.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's very possible that Tennessee loses. Let's say Bama wins this one, and then Florida wins their finale, and Bama loses their finale, Tennessee wins their finale. So all of them go 1-1 in this final stretch.
Yeah.
I think then it would be the craziest thing to decide who has it, because Florida and Tennessee would have split. Bama would
Mhm.
hold a tiebreaker over Florida, but Florida's beaten Auburn, and Auburn beat Bama twice.
Yeah.
So I think Florida's the best team, but I don't know what
Mhm.
you do in that case. And I think that's not even like outside the realm of possibility. I know it's
Yeah.
a little bit getting ahead of myself, but I don't think that's that crazy.
Yeah. I will say one more thing on the ranked games here because I feel like we shouldn't skip this one entirely. How much fun is Julian Reese and Derek Queen versus Danny Wolf and Vlad Golden going to be? That's just an incredible front court matchup. Two top 20 teams, 13 for Maryland, 17 for Michigan. Obviously, Michigan not wanting to look ahead to their finale against Michigan State, which is going to be just an incredibly fun basketball game. But this is a really big one between two very, very good teams in the Big Ten. If you told me that Maryland and Michigan would be a top 20 team in top 20 matchup in March, I wouldn't have believed you at the beginning of the season by any stretch. But here we are, these two teams playing some great ball. This should be a really fun one.
Yeah, I think Maryland's better than Michigan, but I kind of think Michigan's going to be favored, probably
Mhm.
is because they're at home and
Yeah.
they're coming off of a shellacking. Like
Mhm.
Illinois beat them badly, and I think it's a psyche thing.
Yeah.
But if you were to tell me which team would win on neutral, I'd probably make the prediction that Maryland's better. So
Yeah.
that makes these games more fun. That the better team's on the road, in my opinion.
Yeah. Three bubble games to close out the show here, Leif. One of them does involve a ranked team, 15 Missouri, going on the road to take on Porter Moser and the Oklahoma Sooners. 8 Eastern time on the SEC Network. FanDuel favoring Mizzou by 4.5. Lenardi has Oklahoma among the first four out. Xavier going on the road at Butler in the Big East, 7 Eastern time on the CBS Sports Network. FanDuel favoring Xavier to win that one by 1.5. Xavier also among the first four out. And then Cincinnati, who is among the next four out at this point, barely on the bubble. They're hosting Kansas State at 8 Eastern time on ESPN Plus. FanDuel favoring Cincy by 8.5. Again, Oklahoma is in the best position to pick up a marquee win at home against a top 15 team. That puts them in a better position. I'm having a hard time with Oklahoma as a team that's so far below 500 in the SEC. I know they did great in the non-conference. I know they have some big wins, but this feels like a really critical game for them to pick up another potentially big-time win. Obviously, for Xavier and Cincy, the situation is a little bit different. Xavier's got to go win on the road. Butler's not a great team, and if you lose this one, I think that pushes you out of the conversation. Cincy, they're at home at least, but if Kansas State comes in and takes you down, I think that's curtains for Wes Miller and the Bearcats. Any thoughts on these three bubble games and the performances these teams need in this one?
Oh, Cincinnati's got no chance.
Yeah.
And Oklahoma does, in my opinion,
Mhm.
because they've beaten Michigan, they've beaten Arizona, and I
Yeah.
understand it was a long time ago, but they've been so close in so many of these
Yeah.
games. Like they just lost by 1 to Ole Miss and Kentucky, or maybe it was 3 to Ole Miss after the free throw debacle.
Mhm.
But same idea. It was a one possession game. They very easily could have won it, had a shot to win it. If they win this against Missouri, I think they should make it. Like I'd far rather have Oklahoma than Nebraska because
Mhm.
Oklahoma's lost a lot of close games and difficult ones against SEC teams all year. Nebraska has been absolutely pulverized by a bunch of teams, and then they've gotten a few good wins, like we talked about. But there's the points you need to make about the context of who and when they were playing those teams. And so I think they should make it, but I understand the point. Like, what do they have? What are they? 4-12, 5-12 in SEC play,
Yeah.
and that's not something you typically see represented well in the Big Dance.
Folks, that's going to wrap it up for us today here on the Locked On College Basketball Podcast. Another fun show, fun opportunity to look at all these big-time games, these seed line implications, the bubble implications as well. Got another fun slate of games tonight. On Wednesday, I'll be back on Thursday to recap all of these games. Then Isaac and I will be back with y'all on Friday to get you ready for what's going to be a huge weekend. We got conference tournaments already underway. We got some massive regular season finales in the power conferences as well, all coming up this weekend. Thanks again, folks, for listening. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button on YouTube so you don't miss any new shows. As always, we want to say apologies to the lawyer family. Let's go Wild Popes. And until tomorrow, peace out.